Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us if you're trickling in and everything. This is our organisational benefits of Kubernetes webinar with Magic Sandbox, who've helped us organise it. It's the second in a two-part Kubernetes online series that we've been doing between Amsource and Magic Sandbox. The first part was a more practical, engineer-focused Kubernetes 101 we did last month. And this is more of a discussion around how Kubernetes can benefit an organization, the concerns and perhaps misconceptions around the platform. And we've got a few experts involved to discuss that with us and go through the sort of things that somebody who's new to the technology might want to be aware of. So to introduce ourselves, my name's Raj. I'm the marketing manager at Amsource. This is the first and last time you'll hear from me today, which you'll be glad about. Taking over after me will be David, who's our practice lead in the UK, and Mike, who is our practice lead internationally. He works mostly in Berlin, but in Europe and America as well. So they're the two who will be leading the conversation with our panelists. A little bit more about Amsource. We talent solutions, technology business. We work internationally, and we're a technology consultant as well. What we specialize in is our game-changing product. So we don't just help businesses with bums on seats recruitment. There's more up-to-date and game-changing solutions that we do using that. This is part of our ongoing webinar series, as I have said. So there's things you can go back to and rewatch if you'd like to, and I'll go into that more in a slide or two. This is actually our 10th year, so we're quite a new business, but we're getting a bit longer in the tooth now. And one of our services we do is expert advisory, so that's something that Mike especially is involved in terms of helping businesses grow and how they should be growing, rather than just putting the right people in the right places. And if you need to talk to us about business or anything, this isn't the time for that, but you feel more than welcome to contact us for more information about us, and our URL for our website is down at the bottom of most of the slides. DevOps Berlin is actually a group that Mike's international team run in Berlin, and it's a tech community that we put together in Germany, because that's one of the biggest tech hubs in Europe and the world. We organise meetups, so obviously now the time he's not allowed us to do anything, unfortunately, but that's why we're doing these things online instead. And we run a collaborative blog as well, so we work with a lot of cutting edge businesses and startups and organizations over there to discuss the latest technologies and trends in DevOps and in IT and tech in a wider sense, to give people a space to share their work and let it be seen. We moderate a LinkedIn group as well by the same name that aims to do the same things. We work with a mentoring club as well in Berlin that again, Mike does some work with. So he's helping people on a sort of ad hoc basis when they want to, lend his time and speak about their careers and how they can progress within tech. Because as somebody in recruitment, that's something he knows about, is progressing careers. We offer talent solutions as well through that. And have a dedicated team that look after the DevOps. And again, if you want to hear anything more about that Berlin work, then feel free to contact us for more. Going back to the work we've done previously, before we started doing this Kubernetes focus thing, we did a lot on remote working. We did 3 webinars in a trilogy that were focused on the culture of remote working and collaboration, onboarding, and just the general topic of remote working, because it was something that was quite new for a lot of people back in March. Now it's our bread and butter and everyone's used to it. You can tell from our backs, everyone's in 6 different locations and most of us are from home. We work with the likes of DAZN on that, AT&T, Spark Networks, BAE Systems, Mural and more, Solaris Bank. And there was a lot of really worthwhile information that came out of that. So if there's anyone who is still getting used to working remotely or onboarding remotely, especially, or anything like that, then they're really worth going back to and rewatching, and they're all available on our YouTube channels. Or feel free to get in touch with either myself, Mike, or Dave, and we'll happily link you through to those. What's being discussed today, though, is what is Kubernetes and DevOps as a kickoff, just to sort of give some context around our discussion. Who benefits from Kubernetes? Who's it actually for? And who would get the most out of it? What are the common misconceptions around it? There's a lot of rumors and a lot of discussion from people who don't often know what they're talking about too well. Is Kubernetes not a fad? Is it something that's going to run out in 2-3 years? Is it here to stay? Is it a foundational technology? Is it not? That's something else we'll discuss. DevOps and Accelerate, where does that feed into Kubernetes? The investment and the cost that's required as well, because that's often a con that's brought up in line with Kubernetes. Who within a business do you need to upskill in order to install the platform successfully? There's a lot of people who think it's everyone, whereas it might just be a certain subset of people within your team. And then if we've got time, obviously we'll do a Q&A session at the end. But if you want to use the chat function, as some of you already are, to send questions through as we already are doing, then we'll happily pick those up as we go through if they fit in. If not, we'll try and come through to it at the end if we've got the time. Introducing our panel. Mislav is one of the founders of Magic Square Sandbox, and he's an expert at upskilling. K8's an evangelist, cloud native advocate, and experienced tutor, and you'll be hearing more from Mislav in a moment. Nigel Poulton, author of the Kubernetes book, which you can see behind him, handily placed there. I'm sure that was by accident. He does pure weapons grade training. He has a global reach and appeal, and his aim, according to his website at least, is to teach 10 million people Kubernetes and help them get on there. He looks puzzled now, but that's something you've said, Nigel, so I'm quoting you on it. Chris Urwin from Rancher Labs is their VP of Field Engineering. Rancher work in open source and work with Kubernetes as well. They manage K8s at scale, and their platform at the moment is well over 100 million downloads, so that's not a small achievement whatsoever. Chris Stephenson of Humanitec, he's their VP of Product and Engineering, a cloud native developer, graduate at Cambridge and MIT, and our expert panel, so no short of experience there. And as I was saying before, this is the last slide for me, but please use the chat function, post any questions in there as we go through, and we'll pick them up as we go along if we can. If not, we'll get through to you at the end, but I'll hand over to Mike and David now, and I'll thank you.
Thanks, Raj. So yeah, let's kick this thing off. Mislav, can you give us a quick introduction into what Kubernetes is, where that fits in within the whole DevOps culture, and what this actually means for companies rather than just a bunch of buzzwords?
Okay, we're going straight into the questions.
Let's go for it.
No.
Let's go for the expert.
Okay, let's go for it. So yeah, hi, I'm Mislav. I'm the founder of Magic Sandbox. Kubernetes is different things to different people. Basically, if I'm talking to engineers, then we are talking about a lot of kind of abstractions that are being presented. If you're talking to more like managers, then you have to think of it as a kind of new foundation around which to structure your kind of tech foundations of your company and your practices around. The easy way to say it, I would say, is that it's basically a kind of new operating system of the cloud that kind of allows you to do away with the current abstractions of maybe like, we had servers, then we had virtual machines, which are kind of one-to-one replicas of this kind of real infrastructure. But with Kubernetes, you are able to think in terms of workloads and resources and pools of memory and CPUs, and kind of do away with the whole something listening on a socket on a machine, and kind of organize your software differently in a cloud native way.
Cool. Nigel, any comments? You've written the book on it.
You know what? I was kind of disappointed that it wasn't mentioned at the beginning. I've written the Klingon edition of the Kubernetes book. Boldly going where no Kubernetes book has gone before. Anyway, no. I would say, probably echoing what Mislav said there, but Kubernetes is, I guess it's the future of infrastructure and code. I liked his comparison as like an operating system for the cloud. So if we look at Linux or maybe Windows, don't want to upset anybody, but in the way that they kind of abstract that underlying server infrastructure and hardware and networking and stuff, to the point where, like, as a developer or even as an end user, like a customer, you don't care if it's whatever, like Dell servers, HPE servers, Cisco servers underneath, it doesn't matter. Your application can just run on Windows or Linux because they abstract all of like the hard stuff underneath. Kubernetes does the same thing potentially for all the different clouds that are out there, for the on-prem stuff, for the hybrid stuff. Let like maybe almost somebody else care about that complexity, slap Kubernetes on top of it, and that's like your new Linux or Windows, and just run your apps on that. Customers are happy because it does all of the auto scaling, it does all of the self-healing, buzzwords, but zero downtime, rolling updates, all that kind of stuff. And I feel very much like in the way that VMware came along years ago and literally changed the world. And if you didn't get on board with VMware, you'd be in a bad place right now. That like Kubernetes and containers have come along and are doing a similar thing, but are changing things a lot more. So that you really need to be getting on board, because if you don't, in 5 or 10 years time, in fact, 5 years time at the most, I think if you're not on board, you're going to be like, man, we have missed the boat here. And I mean like as an individual, but also as a company and as an organization. Like if you don't move with this, you'll be in, let's just say, not as good a place as you would be if you had moved with it. But I'm waffling, so yeah.
Cool. Chris Stephenson, Humanitec are doing some pretty cool stuff, and I suppose doing your bit to try and ease the adoption. Any points to make?
Yeah, so I think echoing what has been said, I like the idea of kind of operating system in the cloud. I think that makes a lot of sense. Fundamentally, to me, the key thing about Kubernetes is that it does, I think the term is orchestration, that you will see everywhere. It orchestrates your application, so it allows different bits of apps to run, so different services, they might be microservices or something, running in the cloud and running successfully. And it also allows you to run multiple apps next to each other, so you can use your infrastructure effectively. So whereas in the VM world, if you're running one app per VM, then you'd have a lot of unused capacity. You wouldn't be able to kind of make use of the gaps between your resources. So it's also a way of making things more efficient. One of the big things, though, that it does is it really gives developers the ability to focus on just the stuff that they care about, so they can focus on their code and actually getting that up and running, and not have to worry about the details of trying to get things installed on a system, make sure you've got your right drivers installed and so on. All of that comes baked into Kubernetes. Especially as your team gets bigger, a lot of companies start making platforms out of Kubernetes. So developers have an even easier time of getting their code up and running and working really well with this. And then you tend to build up a DevOps organization. I think we'll talk about that in a bit later, who actually end up running the infrastructure and making sure that the developer experience is as good as possible while ensuring that everything keeps running under the hood.
Cool. And last but not least, Chris Urwin, what are your thoughts on Kubernetes as a technology? Coming from the rancher side of things, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting because sort of picking up on what Nigel said, I think the move from virtual machines into from physical machines into virtual machines was sort of an evolution. You had the same sort of management problems. You didn't have the hardware problems, but you still had to manage the operating system in the same way. You just had more now. With Kubernetes, I think what we've done is we've completely revolutionized the way that we actually deliver applications to end users for them to consume. And there's a whole bunch of things that we'll probably talk about later in the way that you need to change in the way that you do that. It's interesting as well is that it always baffles me where you really want to focus sort of talking about Kubernetes, because it's very rare you get a developer who asks for Kubernetes. It's very rare you get an end user who asks for Kubernetes. It's just something that is there that allows sort of developers to deliver their code. It's just a target platform for them to get their code on. And users never know that it's actually there. It's just something that they consume. So it's great. It's here to stay. It is the future of sort of application delivery, effectively, application hosting. And like sort of already been said, I think it's here to stay. There's nothing sort of on the horizon at the moment to replace it.
Cool. Over to Dave.
Who's gone silent?
Dave, you've gone quiet on us.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Yeah, sorry, Chris. Just one thing that I was saying then is, obviously, I know when we were discussing before, we were talking more about like the adoption and the procurement side of implementing Kubernetes. So for the people that are on here, can you talk to a bit more about how this fits in with like open source and the cultural changes and DevOps side of things and the cost side of things as well? I know that's quite a broad statement, but just delving into those topics.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, open source is a whole bag of discussion in itself in the way that you implement it and get it adopted into organizations. But I think one of the challenges that we often come across being an open source organization is that people just think open source is free. And open source, regardless of whether you're using the software for free, is never free. There's always a cost associated with it in terms of you have to upskill people to use the stuff. Then there's the support. Do you do it internally? If you don't, then you procure support from someone else. So we obviously offer support packages for our open source. But then when you offer a support package for open source, you come to the challenge of procurement, because procurement have heard about open source and they go, well, it's free, so why are we paying for it? So when you sort of move into a technology like Kubernetes that's open source and is obviously going to be a linchpin in your organization for sort of running your applications, there's a whole cultural shift that you need to do within the organization. I'd love to say that everywhere moves to a DevOps model and delivers their applications in sort of a nice, efficient way. But the reality is DevOps is a fallacy in most organizations. There's various different definitions of what DevOps are. But for the most part, certainly in the enterprise, typically what you will find is that you have developers and you have operations pretty much in the same way that you do for sort of legacy infrastructure. And it's making sure that you get those guys on board and talking, making sure that you bring along the procurement people with you. Another one that is always a real challenge is sort of the people who look after asset management, because they want something to stick a label on, and you can't stick a label on a container. That container can exist anywhere in a huge bunch of compute resource. You can't locate a physical piece of tin and say, this application runs on this server here. So there's whole new processes around what you need to do to actually monitor how your application's running. So like I said, basically you revolutionize the way you do everything, the way you do security, the way you do provisioning, the way you do asset management. All of that stuff changes when you move into a world of open source and Kubernetes.
Yeah. And Nigel, would you add anything to that?
So I was trying to answer a question on the Q&A, so I'm not sure I quite caught what your question was. Just run it by me real quick.
Yeah, so we're just talking about in terms of adoption and procurement. So, we were talking about open source, cultural changes and DevOps, and then
right, gotcha.
The cost part of things as well, yeah.
Yeah, let me touch on something culturally then, right? And this will probably sound super cheesy, but when you deploy Kubernetes, you're almost forced in a way to bring your development and your operations teams together. I totally get what Chris is saying about DevOps being a fallacy in most places, but something that you're kind of forced to do, which I think is really good, is the way that we define applications in Kubernetes. We tend to have to write a bunch of YAML, and a lot of people hate that, just a markup language, right? But I'm like a super big fan of it, because so back in my day, I come more from an operations background than a developer background. And I was always struggling to get developers, and rightly so, right? But I was always struggling to get developers to document their applications, what network ports they use and all that kind of jazz, right? And we would have these horrible, if I'm being honest, like Word document templates that we wanted them to fill out. And then, of course, they wouldn't. But on the occasion that they did, then they'd be out of date 6 months later when there was a patch or something. And it was messy, but we wanted to document our environment for valid reasons. And we still do, right? So you bring along Kubernetes, and a developer, as they write an application, if they are going to be working with the guys that deploy it, they need to be able to say, right, it uses this particular version of a container image. It operates on this particular network, on this particular port. It uses this particular service account. All this kind of stuff must be documented in order for the application to run on Kubernetes as a platform. Now, because your developers are doing that, you get tons of benefits, right? So operations automatically get this document in YAML format of every application that is deployed, because you can't deploy the application actually without that. But then you want to onboard more people to your organization, new starters or people like that, and you want to give them responsibility for a particular application. There's the YAML files for it, right? Go figure it out yourself. You know exactly what container image it is. You can go and look at the Docker file used to create that container image. You know how it operates on the network. You want to bring somebody from a different team to work on one of your applications? Easy. Throw them that same YAML file, and within 5 minutes, they scan that YAML file, and they've got the kind of nuts and bolts of how the application works. So in a way, right, and I waffle sometimes, right, but I hope I'm making sense. You deploy Kubernetes, and then every time you deploy an application to it, you're forced to document it. And by doing that, you just get tons of benefits. So it almost forces your hands to operate in more of a DevOps way. So I'm a big fan of that aspect of it culturally.
Mislav,
right.
so your MSP are all about upskilling engineers
Yeah.
onto Kubernetes. So what's the challenge there, or
the challenge is always in the beginning for us. Like every time there's a discussion around Kubernetes, people are saying it's kind of complicated. For us, always the challenge is first to show that it's, first of all, a different mindset. It's not this kind of imperative way where you just say if this, then that. But what we always have to say is, of course, it's complicated because it covers such a huge area of your infrastructure, your persistence, your networking, your cluster processes, like everything is covered in there. And I feel that a lot of times people just expect something that you can click like 3 buttons and have it working. Obviously, like Kubernetes is a toolbox, and with a proper kind of DevOps mentality, you will get to that point where you will have a whole templated system where everything will be hooked in together. It's not solved by magic. You can, of course, use something like Rancher that already has a lot of nice environments predefined. But first of all, it's a huge thing. You need to know what you're doing. It's like coming to a Linux box and expecting to know how to set up, IP tables and things like that. You have to know these things. And the second point I'd like to say is that I had a very interesting conversation a while ago that sometimes the DevOps team is actually an impediment to adoption, not because they are against it, just their existence means that people are used to just dumping things onto the DevOps team, kind of creating a ticket or, complaining that things are not working. And just the fact that they are able to go to the DevOps team makes them not go through the pain or struggle of kind of learning it. So it's a very interesting kind of conversation I had. I know how true it is, but thinking back to my times when I was a developer in this large team, that was definitely the case. Like, why would you deal with all this when you can just bother the...
So having a DevOps team surely goes against the whole kind of spirit of DevOps of bringing everyone together. So at what point do you start changing the practices and re-engineering, I suppose, the whole approach to DevOps, rather than the whole point of it is not just dumping it on someone's lap and forgetting about it. That's kind of the reason it's...
There's always going to be a DevOps team, especially for like more crucial parts, but the main, when they start kind of seeing the benefits of it is when you show them that they can basically maintain their own service, that they can have their own namespace with everything deployed. With one command, you deploy your, Elasticsearch, whatever you need, and suddenly you have all this power. So I think that's the way to kind of drive Kubernetes adoption, by kind of enabling people and showing them that they can be independent, instead of kind of forcing them to go through all these weird horizontal pod, autoscaler, weird YAML files, but kind of show them the way,
Chris Stephenson, at Humanitec, your product is a tool to try and bridge that gap between the engineers and the DevOps teams, if I've got that right. Have you got anything to add to the points made by the guys?
Sure. One of the things that I think about when I think about Kubernetes is that it's this kind of cloud concept. Now, whether or not you're actually running in the public cloud or on Google, AWS, Azure, whatever else, or whether you're running on your own hardware, or you're using something like Rancher running in a public cloud or on your own hardware, that's kind of beside the point. The key thing is that you are giving developers, as Mislav said, the ability to self-serve and actually do things on their own. Now, in a lot of cases, the complexity of dealing with Kubernetes directly, especially when it's newly introduced, can be quite high, especially if you have your front-end developers who are normally building TypeScript applications in React, compared to maybe someone who is a hardcore Go developer. But that kind of complexity doesn't have to be an impediment. If you structure things well, if you create nice kind of abstractions, we've already briefly talked about things like templating, then actually this can be a very self-serve position. And I think one of the key things about DevOps is that it should be how the developers and the operations people blend together. It shouldn't be a case of having a team in the middle that's just like handing things over from one place to the other. Ideally, you want your developers to be able to perform tasks which historically have been operations tasks themselves with as little impediment as possible. And in the same way, you want operations people to do things that are maybe considered to be application developer tasks as easy as possible. So one example could be, as an application developer, I should be able to deploy my code. If I make an update, I should be able to get that code up and running. And in Kubernetes, that's relatively straightforward. I can make sure that's running. It'll roll over easily, so I don't cause downtime, and so on. And maybe as an operations person, I want to be able to understand what the configuration is for my application. And as Nigel mentioned earlier, that kind of documentation of the structure really helps those two groups of people to work together. And I think that gives you a kind of essence of DevOps in this kind of idea that everything is on demand in the cloud approach, whether or not you're actually running in the public cloud or not.
So if I was, hypothetically speaking, a CTO or head of engineering, whatever I might be, and I've decided, right, let's do it. We're going to get Kubernetes. We're going to put it in. But before we do that, let's look at our processes. Who, generally speaking, might be good people to try and start that conversation, because you can't just force it on people. You know, in your experience, I'll put this out to anyone in the panel, where might that discussion start? You know, for the people watching this who may be asking this question. Anybody?
I can jump in maybe, or Nigel? Yeah.
Oh no, okay, I was just gonna have a quick pop. I know that a lot of organizations, at least that I've spoken to, have taken a similar approach to Kubernetes as they've taken with when containers themselves were kind of new, and almost when any technology has been new. And I don't know if this is 100% speaking to your question, but whoever the strategic thinkers are within the organization, you tend to then put together like a, like for want of a better term, a SWAT team that will take like a greenfield application or something like that, and test out how will we use Kubernetes and containers within the organization, and try it on like a nice, easy application that if like you don't do a great job, it doesn't really matter. So obviously not line of business or anything like that. And just use that team to sort of skill up, deploy one or two applications, and then have those people start taking it to the wider organization, document how to do it and all of that kind of jazz, and then start picking, you know, some other easy applications within the organization and drafting in other people from wider teams, getting them on board to it. But it generally starts out with a small group of people that are kind of specialists that are apt to taking on a new challenge. You get your head around it organizationally, technology, and all of that kind of jazz. You learn it all, and then you just start taking small steps out into the wider organization. Do you want to go, Chris?
Yeah, I was going to say almost exactly the same as what you've said there. So I think it's very much a case of starting small and building out. One of the interesting things about Kubernetes, especially with the vast number of managed offerings out there, is that actually the barrier to entry is quite low. You don't have to dedicate a whole load of servers that you have to provision and manage yourself. You can spin things up in the cloud very straightforwardly and actually get started within like 20 minutes or something. You can have your first cluster set up. You can have your first application up and running. So it's very much initially usually a case of experimentation and learning as you go. And as Nigel said, the best thing to do is to choose a small, usually an internal application to start off with that you can experiment with and you understand really well, so you can see how that behaves. And then add complexity as you go on. You know, add add external data sources that you need, add more complicated routing, and take this step by step as you go out. The best thing to do, though, is to make sure that the SWAT team is a full cross-section. It shouldn't just be a couple of engineers in one corner. You want to involve people from your operations team. You want to include people from your testing team. That often gets forgotten. And you want to, of course, include your developers. So you want a representative from every single part of your engineering organization. Even bringing in PMs is a good idea, product managers as well, into this conversation, in order to make sure that everyone understands the benefits, everyone works together, and you can troubleshoot issues at this small scale before, when you start rolling it out wider, you suddenly discover that your QA team doesn't know how to test failover in Kubernetes applications, for example. So bring everyone in together, create that SWAT team, but make sure everyone is represented in that SWAT team.
I would just like to add, we've been working with this fairly large bank, and they had exactly that kind of SWAT team, but their purpose wasn't to kind of deliver, working production ready systems. Their purpose was mostly to advocate and teach people. Their main goal was to ensure that the people who interact with it know how to start using it. Otherwise, there's just going to be another DevOps team that has to solve everything. Also, another thing, and I think Chris Urwin can talk a lot more about that. I've had a few interesting conversations with people from Rancher, and it turns out that a lot of, especially large organizations, they already have a bunch of Kubernetes smaller clusters running. People don't even know that they're there. So a lot of times these organizations are taken by surprise, like, okay, I guess we're on Kubernetes right now. I guess that's what we're doing. So probably in every, at least medium plus organization, there are at least a few people tinkering with it. Something's running on it that you're not even aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the number of organizations that we go to, and it's like the higher up management, oh, no, we're not using Kubernetes. But actually, they don't know that they're actually running Kubernetes, because these often start as sort of backroom, like, come on, we want to do this. It's interesting when you go into an organization, sort of going to the various departments and say, oh, yeah, well, we're already using Kubernetes. It's like, that's fantastic. But it is interesting getting it into organizations, because I think sometimes it comes from a top-down push. So you'll get a CTO who goes to a conference and everything's banging on about Kubernetes, and these are the values that we can get out of Kubernetes. And it's a lot harder when it comes from the top as a push down to get developers to adopt it, than ones where typically a developer has wanted to find a more efficient way of working, a more efficient way of delivering an application to basically solve their own problems in the development lifecycle. So where I've done this, I've been a DevOps lead before, even though I hate the title, where what we did was we had an application that was a Java application that was deployed onto virtual servers, as it were. And what we started doing was we started actually dual packaging. So everything was delivered as jar files for delivery to Tomcat. And then we started dual packaging it into containers as well. And that allowed us to develop the skills to sort of, because we already understood the application, we understood the flows very well. Then what you could do is you can actually migrate away from your sort of virtual instances and your legacy sort of infrastructure to a Kubernetes world by actually not having to change the code a huge amount. There's a lot of people who will bang on about you've got to rewrite all of your applications into microservices and everything else. Actually, monoliths work quite well in Kubernetes, and you can scale them. And I think this is one of the fallacies that you get with Kubernetes, that you have to re-engineer a lot of things. Whereas actually a few tweaks to the way that your CI/CD sort of builds and packages your application to put it into containers is typically a few additional lines of code. So it's one of those things that people need to look at.
Yeah, I think it moves on nicely, actually, from one of the guys in the chat's just put a statement, and they've said it helps to give Kubernetes a friendly interface, such as Rancher. Why is Kubernetes so complicated then? Why does it need a friendly interface? I think that's one of the comments we've always had, is that it's complex. Why is that? And then just moving on to that, the following question is it here to stay, or is it a fad? So just those 2 points. Chris, do you want to carry on from that again?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's certainly not a fad. It is complicated. I mean, people have got this view that Kubernetes is really, really complicated. And I think if you go back sort of 4 years when it was at 1.0, it was a real pain. It took days to understand enough to actually be able to stand up a Kubernetes instance and sort of run it. And typically these were developer guys who weren't necessarily used to having to stand up infrastructure to run their applications on. And those were the guys who were discovering Kubernetes because of the value that it could add to the development lifecycle. But I think now you can go to any one of the cloud providers and provide yourself a Kubernetes cluster in a matter of minutes. So I think that the sort of the fallacy that Kubernetes is difficult, whilst it hasn't gone away and what it's doing is very, very complicated, the fact is you now don't have to manage a lot of that complexity. There's a lot of organizations that can help you, Rancher being one, run a Kubernetes cluster very efficiently and very easily. I think that... sorry, I've forgotten where I was going. Yes, in terms, what was the second part of the question that you had in terms of, it was to do with the FAD thing, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's definitely here to stay. I mean, I think it's, I can't remember, there was some survey done where it's like 90% of organizations have some form of applications now running in the cloud on Kubernetes or running in their data center on their virtual cloud on Kubernetes, whether it be a sort of a customer facing one or just an internal one. Everywhere is dipping their toe now into Kubernetes. So it's definitely here to stay. At the moment, I don't see anything on the horizon that's going to sort of displace it, but I guess in 15 years time, we could be looking at the same revolution that we had moving from virtual servers into sort of to Kubernetes and sort of effectively virtualization of applications where you package everything in a single package to whatever the next thing is, whether it be an advanced form of serverless or some sort of other hosted cloud stuff. I don't know, but at the moment, Kubernetes is definitely the most efficient way, I think, to sort of develop and deliver applications at scale.
Yeah. Nigel, would you have anything to that?
Yeah, so I think I agree with everything that Chris said. On the fad front, I would say I totally echo what Chris says. It's not a fad, and we're way past that now. Beyond, all these organizations already having some Kubernetes deployed and it being out in the wild more than we sometimes think. I think on the other side of the fence, the vendor side of the fence, everybody is now on board with Kubernetes. Like not just the major clouds, just about every cloud has its own hosted Kubernetes service. There are so many options out there, including Rancher as well, of course, that will help you just make it so much easier as well, whether you're in the cloud or on-prem. So there's too much momentum behind it. In fact, like all the cloud vendors were, it was a big year last year, 2019, a bit of 2018 as well about hosted Kubernetes. But this year we're starting to see like your HPEs, your NetApps and people like that come along with their own Kubernetes related services. So everybody's on board. It's no longer that the writing is on the wall. It's like you can't see the wall anymore for all of the writing. It's so has that much momentum. On the topic of complexity, it's an interesting one because I think if you were involved with Linux at all, if you wind the clock back, like Linux used to be really hard before Red Hat and some of the others came along. If you were going to compile Linux from source and make your own, then it was hard. And you can still do that if you want to. But for the majority of us, we take one of the easier options, SUSE, Red Hat, that have their own package managers and everything. It's so easy. Like my kids could probably install Linux now, and I never thought that would be the case. And we're almost getting to that point where you kind of wouldn't build Kubernetes DIY yourself anymore. You just go and pick it off the shelf, whether you're on-prem or in the cloud. So it's got so much easier from that aspect. But I do feel like the internal workings of it, like I think we're at 1.19 at the moment, and some of the features, the core features are baked and good. But a lot of the new things that are still coming along that are in alpha and early betas are still a little bit complex. And like, it's not going to go away, Kubernetes. But what I wonder is, like, as it becomes more commoditized, will higher level tools kind of come along and do most of the sort of low level Kubernetes for us? to the point where, and we're not there yet, but I wonder if we're going in that direction where it's like, oh yeah, Kubernetes actually is there underneath this running our applications, but we use whatever it is higher level tool, like we kind of do with Linux now. Like, not many of us, like, I love Linux, don't get me wrong, but not many of us super care about the nuts and bolts anymore. No offense to the people that do. Just because we, to make business easier, we use high level tools that do the hard things and we do the easy things. Yeah.
Yeah. Chris, Stephenson, would you have anything?
Yeah, definitely. So in the answer to the question, is Kubernetes complicated? I would say yes, but. And I think it comes down to what Kubernetes can do. So Kubernetes is complicated because it has 6,000 contributors. It has many, many companies behind it who all want to do their super magic special thing with it. And just as Nigel was saying, the edges have a whole load of crazy things that can be done, especially in the alpha and beta functionalities. But in practice, most people, it's going to probably work with some variation of the 80-20 rule. 80% of people are going to be using 20% of the features, and those are relatively well understood, and you don't have to deal with the complex edge cases that exist around it. But another area of complexity is not just in terms of the inner workings and understanding the concepts around it. There's also the complexity of additional cognitive load that you introduce in your engineering team. So if you have your enterprise Java developers that have been happily plugging away in their JVM for 15 years or so, if you suddenly tell them, right, tomorrow you're going to be deploying on Kubernetes, go into this training course and go and learn Kubernetes, you might get some pushback on that, especially kind of if you do this at scale across thousands of engineers across an organization. What is interesting is exactly what Nigel was saying about these layers, these abstractions that work on top. One of the great things is if you consider Kubernetes as your operating system in the cloud, you can run tooling on top which can really help you. And obviously an example here would be Humanitec, providing this layer of developer-friendly interface, in fact, a developer platform, so that developers can interact with Kubernetes without having to worry about the actual Kubernetes details. So you can spin up in your application and you can say, I need this, I need that. And then you let the platform with the higher level tooling figure out what that means in terms of building Kubernetes YAML and actually making that deployment happen to the right cluster in the right place with the right access to the right bits of resource. So I think that's very much the case. We're now at a situation where Kubernetes is a vital part of many companies' tech infrastructure, but to most developers, Kubernetes should be an implementation detail. You should be able to build your container and not have to worry that it's running on Kubernetes or anything else.
Great. Mislav, would you add anything to that?
I would just kind of like to say that raw Kubernetes, like the question is, why would we need a nice kind of shiny interface? And definitely something like Humanitec or Rancher definitely helps there. The raw Kubernetes itself is fairly unopinionated. Obviously, there's a Kubernetes way of doing things, but it allows you, it's basically a toolbox. It allows you to do basically whatever you want with it and mold it to your needs. And if you think where Kubernetes is kind of evolving, it's basically just becoming a set of APIs, and you don't care what's in the background there. Like already now, what you can do is use something like virtual kubelet and put it on AWS Fargate, and you don't literally think about servers anymore. Like new machines, let's say, are being spun for you wherever you want. So Kubernetes just becomes this kind of flexible API for things to plug into from different storage providers to different, I don't know, platforms on top. So raw Kubernetes itself is fairly opinionated, but it's not meant to be used like that. Either you have your DevOps team build a custom platform, or you use something like Humanitec, Rancher, something like that, to make it easier, these initial decisions.
So I think we've worked out that Kubernetes is complicated because it's supposed to be. It's doing lots of complicated stuff. So there's no getting around from the fact that it can be complicated. Another thing that I suppose, assessing whether or not to implement Kubernetes is always going to be cost. And as Chris highlighted earlier, open source doesn't mean it's free. So, Mislav, I mean, you help organisations upskill their existing teams. Can you maybe shed a bit of light on, is this an expensive thing to do? What kind of commitment, if you're a CFO and the CTO says, I want some money to go and do this, am I going to get that money?
It's a very kind of tricky question for me, because obviously I'm trying to sell, let's say, education. And for me, I think companies are, let's say, they're not like, if you tell them to pay this much for our bootcamp or somewhere, they're like, oh, that's kind of expensive. But if you calculate the amount of time they just spent, reading around and in weird meetings, it's much more than, let's say, it would take that we just show them how to do it. Yeah. So it's a hard estimate to say. I think if you're just start out with Kubernetes. If you're a large company, then it's worth doing the transition. If you're dealing with some kind of medium e-commerce store that's plugging away, there's no need to do it. Like, just keep whatever you are. What I've heard about estimates is, and it sounds kind of it's going to be at least $1 million to transition any kind of sizable organization there. But it may sound a lot, but if you think how much time you're kind of wasting on, how much salary time is being wasted on just random things, might not be that much. I'm probably not the highest qualified person to speak about this in this group, so that's it.
Okay, who wants to put their point of view forward on this? I mean, I'm not looking for the exact down to the pennies and the cents of it all, but if you're trying to pitch this to the people who are going to give you the budget, is this something that you're going to make fly? I guess because that you need money to implement anything, right?
Hey, do you mind if I have a punt at this?
Yep, go for it.
I'm going to take a slightly different angle, right? Because I have absolutely no idea how many dollars you need within your organization. But I'm looking at an old tweet here, right? From John Chambers, former CEO of Cisco, right? Predicting that 40 to 50% of the Fortune 500 won't exist in 10 years. And if we wind the clock back, 75% of today's Standard & Poor's 500, I guess, wasn't around or 10 years ago. And one of the links there, right, is back to their use or adoption or kind of hesitation to use and leverage technology. So quite often a business will have something that's working really well, not on the back end infrastructure wise, but it might have a product that's great today. And we know that a product that's great today is not necessarily going to be popular or great in 10 years. And if you don't move your product, you're going to disappear as a business. And it's my opinion, right, that if you take a similar approach to technology and say, we're just going to continue running whatever, right, on IBM iSeries and big Unix, HP UX or whatever, you're going to be struggling. Like, in fact, the easier example is VMware. If you want to still be deploying one application to one physical server and overspeccing that physical server and never touching the sides of it, so to speak, then you're not going to exist as an organization in the future because you're not going to be efficient enough. And I think if you take that approach with Kubernetes and containers, it's happening, right? And if you don't, I'm going to bring it back to cost. It's cheesy, right? But the cost to your business might be that you might not be in business anymore, or the cost to you as an individual, as a developer or an operations or a DevOps or whatever, might be that you can only have the crap jobs because you haven't skilled yourself up to be able to get the good jobs going forward. So it's not like a dollars and cents or a pounds and pence answer, but it's cost related, because if you don't get on board with this stuff and whatever the next thing is as well, right? Because unfortunately we have to keep on the rat race, then there is a cost, and that could ultimately be that you're out of business or out of a job.
Is that what you call the Kodak moment, Nigel?
There you go, mate. Yeah.
Yeah, adding to that, I think one of the things that it's actually really difficult to do is actually give a really good ROI on Kubernetes implementations, because it's very difficult to say we are going to save you money, but the benefits that you get in terms of being able to hire developers who can develop in multiple different languages and deploy to your infrastructure, the fact that you can deploy at the drop of a hat a new version of your application, the fact that you've got additional resiliency that you didn't have before in your application, and sort of the SLAs that you can go to are a lot tighter. But actually calculating a hard cost is very, very difficult when it comes to Kubernetes.
If I could just add something onto the end of that, we've talked about Kubernetes being the kind of operating system of the cloud. Another way of thinking about it is it's kind of commodifying a lot of what's going on. And what we know across all industries, be it software or be it selling widgets from an assembly line, commodification drives down costs. Why does it do that? It means that you have standardization. It means that suddenly you can hire people that know how to do stuff with what you have. It means that when you buy stuff off the shelf, you need to do less work to plug it in. So it's a long play. As Chris said, ROI day to day is probably limited. Just looking at compute resource, you're going to be approximately using the same compute resource before and after, because you're running the same application and it's basically running on the same system. There's a bit of overhead, but there's a bit of saving. Probably works out to be roughly the same. But what you're playing for is the long game. Can you continue to buy monitoring tooling that will allow you to monitor your applications? Can you still plug in databases using the appropriate drivers or the appropriate operators that now exist for these things? It's just giving you that kind of future space to continue innovating as a business.
Cool. So I think we're nearly towards the end of the points we wanted to cover. So before we go to the Q&A, I'm going to put everyone on the spot, starting with you, Chris Stephenson. Why should you adopt Kubernetes?
So I think kind of what I said before, Kubernetes is the new standard. It is how people are building applications today. If you want to know the pedigree, I mean, this technology has been around for 15 years. If you go all the way into Google and look at Borg, which is what it all comes from. So it's been tried and tested at the biggest companies in the world. It's been around itself for about 5 years now. It's not going to go away. Adoption is happening everywhere. Every single vendor is jumping on board. And if you're not on board, you're going to be missing out. You're going to have more expensive costs. It's going to be more difficult to hire people for your legacy systems. It's going to be harder to build modern applications. And it's going to leave you behind, basically.
I think Chris covered quite a lot, so I don't want to steal everyone else's thunder, but has anyone got any final points before we maybe jump on to some questions?
I was just going to actually say, whilst I said before, sort of monoliths work perfectly well in Kubernetes, Kubernetes isn't necessarily the answer for absolutely everything. There are still use cases where Kubernetes can actually add overhead. So I would say certainly it's going to help in the vast majority of instances, but it's not a silver bullet for solving all of your application problems, your scalability problems and everything else. There's other things that you can look at. There are other solutions out there. It's just that Kubernetes is going to help in the vast majority of instances. So I don't want to oversell Kubernetes because obviously that's where we make our money, but it's always worth considering that whatever you're doing, there may be an alternative. You may actually be overcomplicating your solution if you do go into Kubernetes. It may give you some flexibility, but it depends what your requirements are. So it's one of the things I'd always say, make sure that you have a solid use case for doing it, because if you don't, the business justification, and certainly when you tie that in with an inability to calculate a true ROI, actually it's a very difficult sell internally for a lot of people. So unless you have some real business benefits, then sort of it may not be the time for you to adopt Kubernetes just yet.
I would like to add one thing which I always try to plug, and I don't think it's being talked a lot, and I do not personally understand why every large CIO of a large organization isn't talking about it much more. But for me, the parts of Kubernetes that are not being talked about are the whole kind of dealing with cluster processes like admission controllers and things like that. So not only can you deploy, like basically every software vendor now has their software packaged up as an operator on Kubernetes, but not only that, you can literally control what gets deployed onto your cluster and whether it's of sufficient quality, whether everything is like checked off, and you can have it baked into the cluster itself. And for me, this is one of the parts of Kubernetes that's not being talked a lot, and I think we should devote more attention to it in the future.
You're going to write a blog on it and we can share it on DevOps Berlin, Mislav?
I will. Okay.
There we go. You heard it here first.
Mike, I've got a quick one. I agree with Mislav, but to Chris Urwin's point, like I'm constantly saying to people that Kubernetes isn't for everybody, and like Chris has said, it's not that silver bullet. I would just, and I'm sure Chris probably means the same as well, I just always want to caveat it to people that if it's not for you right now, don't push it to one side and totally forget about it. Because I think going forward, as it matures and as it sort of swallows more and more use cases, we've had some questions on the chat about IoT and edge and stuff like that, which wasn't really a thing in the past, but is becoming more and more of a thing. I just see it almost as like swallowing up more and more as we go forward. So if it's not for you today, and it might well not be for you today, definitely keep at least half an eye on it so that you're not bitten later down the line and being like, oh crap, yeah, we discounted it before and we've just ignored it since, and we really shouldn't have.
Yeah, I think that's just IT in general, though, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You're constantly reevaluating, constantly learning, there's constantly change. So yeah, absolutely. So whilst it's not for you now, yes, in the future, you may have a project that comes along that absolutely you can take advantage of the Kubernetes.
Yeah, 100%.
Excellent, excellent, good stuff. I think we've covered quite a lot there. Are there, Raj, have you been keeping an eye on the Q&As? Anything we've missed? Anything that people, any pressing questions before we thank everyone and wrap things up?
Let me have a look.
I think most people have had their questions answered in the Q&A function, but if anyone's got any last minute functions, just last minute questions, just get it into the chat box now, and we'll get them answered for you.
Yeah, I think as Dave says, I think most people have had their questions answered in text as we've been going through.
Right. Oh. Well, I think that's gone really well. Thanks everyone for joining us, Mislav especially for your efforts and collaboration with us on the last two. We will be writing up some key takeaway points. I say we, Raj, will be writing these things up, and we will be able to make this recording available. So we'll be making contact with everyone who's signed up to Eventbrite, and we'll be posting a lot of content in the coming months. There's also some cool stuff up there from Mislav and Chris at Rancher, already on devopsberlin.de, so keep an eye on there.
Yeah, and I think also if there's anyone on here that perhaps has mine and Mike's contact details, but might not have any of the other guys' contact details that have hosted, and they want to speak to them about something, then just let us know and we'll gladly put you in touch.
That's it. Everyone buy Nigel's book. Everyone, everyone sign up to Chris at Rancher. And if you're implementing Kubernetes, definitely get in touch with Mislav. He'll train you. And if you don't want to do that, Chris at Humanitec will install Humanitec and leave you to it.
No, but yeah, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you guys for hosting. It's been great.
Yeah, brilliant. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Take care. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.